You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're producing this podcast for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're producing these and putting them all out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm fine, Jay. And you?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm very excited about tonight. We're reviewing Star Trek Season 3, Episode 20, Tin Man, which I think is going to give ground to a lot of fertile conversation about exobiology. I think there's a really good story here. Tin Man is, I think, one of those really great episodes that every time it comes on, and I can say this for, my wife Margot and your daughter-in-law. Every time Tin Man comes on, she actually stops and watches this episode with me. So, I think there is something special about the general presentation that we'll be talking about tonight, because in one way I think it holds a place in fans' hearts, but at the same time, it's also a very interesting look into, I think, sci-fi of the past versus sci-fi of today. But we'll get into all that. Before we get started, however, one thing that we always talk about at the beginning of the show, I mentioned that, I mentioned the in-world debut of the episode, the in-world being when we are here and now. And then I also mentioned the star date, which is the supposed date that the show's taking place in the real world, in the in-world story of Star Trek. So, um, our our episode that we're reviewing today, Tin Man, debuted on April 23rd, 1990, but for the in-world star date, the episode takes place in 43779.3. Dad, we talk about these star dates a lot, but we never really talk about what they actually mean. So, I went and did a little digging on mentalfloss.com, and I found out the history of star dates going back to the original series, where Gene Roddenberry basically produced these things like on a relatively close number, but the number itself actually didn't mean anything. It wasn't actually until the Star Trek: The Next Generation that things became more consistent. So, if you would allow me, a star date is a 5-digit number followed by a decimal point and one more digit. An example is 41254.7. The first two digits of the star date are always 41. The 4 stands for the 24th century, and the 1 indicates the season. The additional 3 leading digits will progress unevenly during the course of a season from 000 to 999. The digit following the decimal point is generally regarded, and I find this interesting, Dad, and I want to know what you think about this, as a day counter. So everything after the decimal point, folks, is a day counter. It's interesting to note then that during the duration of a TNG season, that one season is 1,000 days. So, I think that's very interesting that a season arguably takes place over 1,000 days. So, looking at that, do you have any reflections on like how star dates are used, and knowing that there is a 1,000-day time period? I just kind of want to. I know I should be able to do this math off the top of my head. So, like each season roughly covers 2.5 years, essentially. of like storytelling in progress with these characters. I think that's actually a very interesting time frame because a lot can happen in our lives in 2.5 years, and there's a lot of like things that can happen to that crew in between missions that we see. Um,
Yeah, just look what's happened to the world because of COVID in the last almost three
right.
years now, or
So,
two actually. Yeah,
so when you know that that these star dates have some actual meaning to them now, and kind of the parameters behind them, what do you think? Do you really have any reflection, or
I read
I
over.
think the most fascinating thing is like the day counter in a way,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I think that shows the pacing of the actual
right,
episodes, and I
right.
might pay attention a little bit more to it in the future.
Yeah, you had shared with me the mental floss article, and it was interesting because there's some episodes that like one episode was put out before another, and the previous one actually has a later star date.
Right.
So, and that's just probably how they put the shows out and so on. But I think the key thing is that, particularly as they got in the next generation, and then it folded over into Voyager and DS9 and so forth, they had
Mm-hmm.
a common system. And
Mm-hmm.
my only other comment is, you think about it, the military uses Zulu time, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically, Greenwich Mean Time, Universal Time, because everybody has to work off the same time. If you're ferrying an F-18 across the Atlantic to some base in Europe, and you have to refuel, you want to make sure that you're on the same time to meet the tanker so you can refuel and not run out of gas and crash into the sea.
Right.
And I think this applies to the Star Trek universe, so that um, if ships are going to meet in interstellar space, whether it's Klingon or Romulan or Federation, everybody has to have some sort of agreed upon time reference. And that gets into also subspace communication and so on.
Thank you for bringing up the idea that everyone has to have an agreed upon sense of a GMT or Greenwich Mean Time, or as you say, Zulu time.
And and
Um,
and the other thing is, in actuality, if this were all real, it probably wouldn't work because of the speeds at which they travel and the time
right.
shift and so forth.
Well, so okay, we're bringing up actually a lot of ideas in physics and astrophysics.
Mhm.
We're getting a little bit uh, into cosmology. So and I can't remember it for the life of me, folks. And Dad, I apologize because I'm going to butcher this really badly. I was watching a video recently on how we have this misconception of the size of the universe. That right, I think the video says, and the video might get this wrong, but we've been able to measure at least 93 billion light years of space so far. And but the question becomes like, okay, well, how long would it take us to traverse 90 billion light years if we had something like warp? And someone was saying, like, well, that's the wrong way of looking at it because you're asking how long, but to have something that would allow you to travel 90 billion light years in the first place, let alone a billion light years, let alone 1 light year, um, it would have to be something that condenses time down for you to the point where like the travel is worth it. Because one thing that we don't really talk about a lot on the show, and I don't think it's really discussed a lot in Star Trek in general, um, and it actually might get touched on in the next episode. Not not Hollow Pursuits. It's the one after that. It's the one where Data's kidnapped. I'm trying to remember.
Oh, the most
Um,
toys.
yeah, the most toys. Great episode. But there is one where that's the episode where they're trying to find some sort of mineral or deposit that's really difficult to like transport from ship to ship. So they have to take it to the Enterprise from like one merchant ship to the Enterprise via a shuttle. And this stuff is so rare and so dangerous to handle that they have to go, I think, 3 weeks in some other direction to find more of it.
If they didn't have enough when they went to this one planet in that episode, the closest deposit where they could obtain more was 3 weeks away, and they
At
actually
work,
they had an emergency situation because they had to use this high tritium, I think they called it,
right,
to decontaminate a water supply on a Federation colony.
right. And just the entire idea that even at warp, with this incredible technology that can ferry them across the stars, even at warp, it would still take them 3 weeks. And it makes you stop and think about, well, these stories are being told over 1,000-day time span, and and you bring up a lot of good points, and I keep going back to the Greenwich Mean Time issue that you brought up. How would we really discern a universal time when we are kind of ripping across space time in general? Um, I think that you would have to have actually some sort of. This is going to sound odd, folks, and Dad, stop me if this sounds stupid, but I'm just conjecturing. I would actually think that you would actually have to have some sort of um, marker of temporal permanence. Because if you distort space time and you actually slow down time um, when you travel to the speed of light, you would not only have to measure distance, you would also have to be able to measure time. So it wouldn't just be like the amount of time traveled from point A to point B, but you would also have to account for the amount of time endured by the place of origin or the place of
Yeah,
wherever you're going.
that makes sense. It's like you have a geographical point in a
Right.
country. Like there's a place in Madrid that all distance is measured, from and in Spain, and you'd have to have a start time that you would measure from in the same manner.
So, people are starting to talk, and I don't know if they're talking about it correctly, but they're starting to talk about things like the fourth and fifth dimension. And a lot of people think that time is in itself the fourth dimension. And I think in that sense, having to have some sort of four-dimensional thinking in terms of how we assail this problem is going to require some very intricate and some very imaginative ways of conceiving the universe that I don't necessarily think is beyond our bounds, but it's going to take a few more generations to figure this out because, I think when we talk about distance and speed, I think that we can figure out distance and speed, but now we're talking about technology that's really going to need to be able to manipulate the time barrier in some way. And the time barrier is actually a real thing in terms of physics, and physics actually has to take account of things like time. But and I know we're going off on a tangent here, folks, with a Stardate thing, but time in itself is not only this immeasurable thing. Um, it's also like this mysterious constant that we have to account for, but we don't know how to account for still yet in physics. So, you know, for something like the 24th century USS Enterprise to work with its warp drive, we will have to have reached beyond our current reckoning of not only physics but astrophysics and probably quantum physics to solve the problems needed to really get us from point not just from point A but from point A1 to A12 because I think we're in some ways talking about time jumping.
Yeah.
Um, but let's dig into
Yeah,
the episode.
let's stop there and get into the episode, right?
Yeah. So Uh, the USS Enterprise is an initial step in the process of surveying systems for Federation colonization. They are on a routine assignment to detail atmospheric charts of the Hayashi system when the USS Hood is detected by Worf on long-range sensors, quickly gain on the USS Enterprise. Captain Robert DeSoto of the Hood, a longtime friend of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, as well as Commander Riker's first captain, which I didn't immediately remember until I found out on Memory Alpha, uh, comes to the Enterprise to inform them that they've suddenly been given an assignment by Starfleet to enter Romulan space, and they will be taking on a mission specialist named Tam Elbrun, which draws immediate concern from both. I think it draws concern of everyone in the crew because it's quickly revealed that Tam Elbrun is infamous due to his involvement in what we will soon learn is called the Garusha disaster, as well as once being a patient of Deanna Troi when she was on Beta Z studying psychology. And this, of course, leads us right into the show.
Yes.
Um, so I wanted to get started by talking about the Hood for a second. One thing that I think the show has started to do better this season than it did in previous seasons is kind of build out the wider universe of Star Trek. So now we're seeing Riker's former captain, but it's not only a former captain, it's Jean-Luc Picard's personal friend. Like, he and Robert address each other on a first name basis. Same thing with Will Riker. I think it's very cool that the writers are taking these things into consideration now because beforehand we only really had like, okay, if you wanted to really talk about Starfleet, they're going to go to San Francisco and they're going to go to Starfleet headquarters or they're going to go to Space Dock. But like if we don't really ever see them run into any. I don't remember them running into other Federation ships a lot in the first two seasons. And just seeing the Hood in this episode, which I think is an Excelsior class, which seems to be the standard model for older Federation ships.
Yes.
It seems
Right.
like
Uh-huh.
when we see them, which I guess is a production holdover from the movies. Um, I I do find it interesting that like we're also starting to be led into like wider events that are happening outside of the events of the Enterprise D. And one of these things is the Garusha disaster involving the specialist named Tam Elbrun. So, getting into what the Garusha disaster is before we get into who Tam Elbrun is, because I think it's kind of important. So the Garusha disaster is this event that has cost the lives of 47 Starfleet personnel, among them Captain Darson of the USS Adelphi and two of Commander William Riker's classmates, which causes William Riker to have an immediate grudge against Tam Elbrun. The thing that we are to discover about Tam Elbrun is that Tam is a gifted telepath, even by Betazoid standards, and is a specialist for Starfleet in first contact situations. So Tam Elbrun is a telepath of immense power. Like Deanna Troy, Deanna's half beta said, and she has empathic abilities, which means she has the ability to read and monitor your thoughts and feelings to kind of get a sense of what you're thinking and feeling to the point that she can tell whether or not you're lying. Tam Elbrun is a full-blooded Beta Z. I'm sorry, a full-blooded Betazoid who had the unfortunate happenstance of being born with a genetic. I guess they would deem it a genetic defect where
Probably. Yes.
his psychic and telepathic powers were engaged from birth. So from a baby, he has been bombarded by the sensory output of every mind that's around him with an inability to kind of control it or meter it. It seems, and he's just learned to endure.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that just to throw in there that he has telepathic tinnitus or telepathic
yes,
tinnitus. Since
I
I
think that's
would, since I would mention that since I developed some tinnitus or tinnitus about a month ago, and it's
it,
that
it,
sound in your ears that's always there.
Well, I think the Tam Elburn character is really interesting because on one hand, I think you describe the constant noise of it very well. But I think in 1990 we had a very I think that we had a very different way of looking at people who experience social difficulty because of learning or
Mm,
behavioral or functional disabilities like the one Tam Elburn has.
hmm.
And I think by today's standard, um, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of evidence and reasons to think that like he would be placed somewhere more on the autism spectrum. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that we are starting to see a lot of characters that are um I want to get this term right, aneurotypical or neurodivergent. And I think that it's important to note this because this is something that is being talked about a lot now in our culture today. Being able to take account for more neurodivergent individuals who have things like ADHD or struggle with things like depression or learning disabilities, and a whole assortment of issues. And you know, Tam, I think, played by what's this actor's name because he's fantastic. Um, Harry Groner. There is a I think the brilliance of Groner's performance in this is that there is a seriousness and sympathy placed on the weight that this character is having to bear. And on one hand, like I think this episode deals with like the discomfort that people not having to deal with these kind of things experience when they have to run up with someone who doesn't think or feel like they do. And the tension I think in this episode is really well placed in like people having to do things that are very difficult on a human level. I talk about neurodivergence, I talk about neurotypical individuals, but at the end of the day, the things that are being talked about in these discussions now are like, how do we really learn to get along and consider each other in a more positive, meaningful way? And I bring this up because I think this episode, and we'll dig into it in its myriad ways, I just wanted to get this part out of the way. I think this episode does a really good job in terms of trying to take a humane look at the issue of these relationships and trying to give every character a compassionate look in terms of, you have Picard and Riker who don't know how to deal with Tam because to to them Tam's way of thinking is completely outside of their paradigm. They can't understand how anyone would put themselves first because they've never had to deal with the experience of hearing everyone in their heads all the time. They don't see people the way Tam sees people. On the other hand, you have Troy, who has just a who has a very good idea of what Tam's going through, but not to the level that she will ever be able to experience because she's only half Betazoid. Like he's dealing with something that is not only like common among her people, but so rare in some cases, it's completely out of her wheelhouse.
I'm
And finally, if I
Yeah, go
may, and
ahead. Sure.
finally, there's Data, who becomes kind of like this confidant and friend that Tam Elburn's probably never had in his life because for the first time, Tam Elburn can deal with someone and have to get to know someone that he can't read or think about.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, the thing I wanted to say is, I think your comment about comparing Elburn to someone in modern times being on the autistic spectrum makes sense because he gets all this telepathic input that's really overwhelming him. He's probably
Hmm.
having to fight to deal with it. It's like that, he knows, gives the, use the term, the tide that never ends. So it's a tide that's coming
Yeah.
in all the time. And so
Well,
that will push him to try to isolate himself because it'll cut down on the noise. And as you said, he gravitates to data because he doesn't get any, readout from him. And the other thing, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but the other important thing is his telepathic powers match up with that uh, of the Tin Man, who we
Gum too. Yeah.
find out is Gomtu. And since because of his past with that incident where 47 Starfleet crew were killed
The
and so
Garushtas.
forth, yes, that when Elburn communicates with Gomtu with Tin Man, that results in the uh, what is it, a Romulan ship that is destroyed,
Yes.
and this shockwave comes and really damages the Enterprise. Then Picard and Riker think, well, this guy only cares about himself, and Elburn, did you give any thought of letting Tin Man know what was going on? That
Right.
the reaction could possibly be harmful to the Enterprise.
Well, I think it's one of those things where, like, we put ourselves in such a. And I've always tried to. This is going to sound weird. I've always tried to put myself as not only a human being, but also as an author in the mode that everyone has a unique story, but we're all agreeing to take part in one central story. Like, we're all agreeing to, like, stop at the red light. We're all agreeing to, not shoot each other when we get mad. There's a lot of agreements that we make every day to make this shit work. Um, we always have the assumption that even though there's an agreement to make shit work, that shit is working for everyone else. And in this case, that's not happening here for people like Tam Elbrun. Tam Elbrun can't value and relate the same way that you and I can. He can come to the same conclusions, but the way he gets there and the importance he places on certain things is so remarkably different. And that's not saying it's good or bad, but it's so different from how we perceive it, because on one hand, from Riker and I'm sorry, from Picard and Riker's perspective, yes, he is irresponsible and untrustworthy because he doesn't care about the 1,100 people on the ship when Gomtuit releases that shockwave that destroys the first Romulan vessel. But what Tam does care about is saving potentially the last of a species in the galaxy at whatever the cost. So, there, on one hand, there is this kind of ignorance and irresponsibility, but there's also this strange nobility that, before the end, both, Picard agrees to, um, out of a deference to the general idea that I think all of them agree on, that life is worth saving. I'm sorry, I know that was a bit of a tangent. Um, but what you have had to work in several, well, you've had to grow up with me, and I had to have certain things that were dealt with. Um, and of course, there was, Catherine had to have certain things that she had to have dealt with. When it comes to dealing with children, and I just wanted to ask you your perception on this, when it comes to dealing with children who have learning disabilities or disorders or neurodivergence, um, do you have any reflections on like how just any reflections in general as a parent, as a person?
I think, but thinking back on um, the learning issues that you and Catherine had, and Mom was the one that really took the lead in figuring that out, but she did a very good job. And we lived in St. Louis. She studied, how individual education plans had to be designed and how there were certain federal and state laws that had to be complied with to help children that identified had these conditions. And thinking on it right now, it seems like these differences in how children learn, there's no normal like anything normal's not really tight right here. It's not a line.
Yes.
It's a range.
Yes.
It's a bell curve. And I
Yes.
think that what educators realize is that you have to design how students are taught based upon not a rigid approach, but the fact that students' minds work differently. And I think one of the big challenges we have in society today is that even though educators understand that, a lot of times they don't have the resources to help those kids. I mean, if teachers don't
Absolutely.
have enough pencils, or there was a story the other day where I forget, somewhere in the Midwest, some school board had a couple $1,000s in $5
Oh,
bills or
South
something.
Dakota.
South Dakota, so they threw it all out so that the it was like a mad dash for the teachers to see how much money they could scoop up so they could go and buy paper for their classroom. It's like, how stupid.
Well, it's so degrading and so demeaning on a
Mhm.
human level for those teachers because on one hand, you're all celebrating them fighting over this money, but like you're watching people desperately trying to take care of your children's future, and
It's
you're
like
laughing.
it's like a real life sick Jerry Springer.
It really is.
Yeah,
I think one thing that like this current era has shown me, and now, yeah, and I have to say your comments on education really do hit home, especially now with now that I'm a parent and I have to worry about Ben's education down the road. Um, I think you had an interesting thing to say when you said it's really a bell curve, and I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think one thing though that like teachers have to struggle with, and I went to grad school for secondary education. I obviously didn't finish grad school, folks. Um, but one thing that I think like teachers really have to struggle with is on one hand they want to take a wider approach when it comes to teaching children, and there's a lot of work being done to you know try to better address the needs of kids that have special needs. But on the other hand, education is such a state mandated thing, and there's this push to adhere to a line. And in adhering to that line, I have found, and this is just my perspectives, so many children fall through the cracks because we try to adhere so closely to some idea of, I think this gets into the general problem as well. It may get into the problem that we see here between, like, institutionalists like Riker and Picard. Actually, I'm not going to put Picard in this. I'll just put Riker in this because Riker really is set to be the person against Tam Elbern in this episode. Um, I think you have institutionalists like Riker who are the neurotypical people that thrive in this kind of society where if you adhere to the line and you work hard and you fall into this relative set of what people think are acceptable career paths, um, you get rewarded to a certain extent versus people like Tam Elbern who, if he didn't have to deal with this disability that he has because of this genetic defect, there's it's very likely like he could still be doing what he's doing right now, being a Federation ambassador, or a Federation mission specialist in First Contact. It's just he would be doing it without this overwhelming, almost crippling burden every day. And I want to bring this up because it gets to a question you asked at the end of the notes. The episode brings up questions about an individual sense of purpose in relation to each other, in relation to others. Is the sense of this variable among different peoples, i.e., do some individuals not care about, I think, others? Um, I don't. I think that's a great question, but I would answer it by saying I think it is not necessarily the best question. Um, and I think this gets directly into education. I think everybody inherently, intrinsically, some way cares about each other. We have to, as biological beings, to survive. I think the I think the issue at play when we talk about things like purpose and how a person's purpose fits into what they do. Um, Education is a key part in that, and helping people define their purpose is intrinsic to our current education system, but every education system. Sorry, go on. You were about to say
Well, I'm
something.
just going to say that just on in relationship to the statement I made in the end, I think that there are some individuals, due to nature and nurture, that they grow up and they are so selfish that they
Oh,
really don't
absolutely.
they don't care about others at all. And
Well,
and, and,
that's the
and,
thing.
and some of these are criminals in nature and so forth, um, and so on. But getting back to the whole purpose. Um, it gets the whole idea is there's one episode, I guess we recently came up, or maybe it's in this episode that Data says, "Oh, I know." When he was talking to Lal, his daughter,
Yes.
she was saying, "What is my purpose?" And he
Mm-hmm.
said at one point, "Well, we are to make the society in which we live better." But that's not
Mm-hmm.
his exact words. And that's what kind of a philosophy that I try to teach you and Catherine and Michelle is while you're here living, try to leave making the world a better place. Now that gets into the practical aspect is again that, education is not a very narrow band. Um, for instance, my younger brother always thought that I was extremely smart. And in some areas I was, in some areas I wasn't. Like when it gets to higher math, I don't do well.
Mm-hmm.
He is excellent at higher math because he's basically a nuclear engineer. I have skills that he doesn't have. He has skills that that I don't have. So
Mm-hmm.
and it gets into what I think we're starting to gravitate very slowly, which is stupid. That we need to go a little bit more like the Germans do, not as perhaps as rigid as they do it, Germans being Germans, where you test out at a point as to whether you should stay on an academic track or whether you should be taught a technical skill. And I won't use a term
Mm-hmm.
trade. I think it's more technical skill related to engineering or,
Right.
a uh, manufacturing process, that sort of thing.
You know, I think when we talk about things like purpose in education, I think there's two things at play that we're really discussing here. I think on one hand we're discussing intrinsic purpose, like why are you here? What is the value of you as a person to yourself, to your family, as an individual in society? But I think there's another half of this that we often miss that is maybe not at play here when we discuss the world of Star Trek, but it's at play here when we discuss our world, and that there's an economic purpose too to education. As much as we want to talk about education teaching you to be a better person and be a better member of society and being thoughtful about your place in it, our American education system has always been geared towards getting people um, able to read, write, and communicate well enough to maintain, and hold a job. Um, there is no part of our education system, even if you wanted to be someone like a philosopher, the idea that you just sit around all day thinking about the universe, like, okay, that's great. You need to still find a way to turn your thinking of the universe around and pay your rent. Um, that has always been baked into this kind of idea of educational purpose, and I think in some ways, like, that doesn't fit certain individuals, like Tam Elbrun, because getting to the question of purpose as it relates to his conversation with him and Data, you know, you brought up the episode with Law, and you're right. Thank you for bringing that up. I completely forgot Data told Law that our purpose is there to. Um, can you say that again? Was it to care for each other or be?
It was more that I think, as I recall, it was like we need to contribute to the society in which we live, something like
So
that.
so when Data and Tam are, I think they're in Data's quarters, and
Yes.
they're talking about, Data is brought up, like, I I find it I find it interesting slash disturbing. You can't read me, because it brings up into the question of, like, do I exist and what is my purpose? And I think it gets to the point where I think it's Tam who asks, "Is that the purpose of existence, to care for someone?"
Yes.
No, is it Data who asks Tam? It's Data who asks Tam. Um, Data asks, "Is that the purpose of existence, to care for someone?" And I
Hmm.
think Tam Elbrun says, "It is for me." And I find that interesting that you brought it up, because it gets into the question of, like, when these episodes are maybe being presented to us, or when the story's taking place, because Data should know this, that, like, the idea of being there to take care of someone is an integral part of life. But Tam is the one who's saying, like, this is what I'm here to do. I'm here to take care of someone. And in many ways, like, when it comes to the question of purpose, even Data is a creature bound to this idea that he has to serve a function to produce some sort of outcome. And in this case, for everyone aboard that ship and part of that crew, it's making sure that ship runs so they can get the stuff that needs to be done for the Federation done. Um, Tam's mission is not that. His purpose is not there to make the Federation run, or make the Federation better, or even to make the people around him on the ship better. His only job is to rescue Gomtu. So, like,
Well, in this episode, but in if you look at it in what he's done for the Federation as a first contact
true,
specialist, he does have a function for the Federation.
very true. He is that person that is there as the needed intermediary
But
for.
but I agree in this episode, even when they're far away from the Tin Man, it's like the Tin Man, Gomtu, has some sort of telepathic powers, and he kind of, again at a great distance, senses Elburn's presence, and
Mhm.
they start to tune in with one uh, another. And I don't know if there's any caring on Gomtu's part, but Elburn, sensing the uniqueness of this communication he's starting to have, that puts him into his caring role.
So, yeah, I think that is a great way to segue into the actual discussion of, like, the actual mission itself, because we've been talking a lot about Tam and Data and purpose, and I think we've had some good discussion about that. Um, but let's actually dig into Tin Man or Gomtu for a second. So when Tam comes aboard, they've discovered that Starfleet has discovered that a star in the Beta Stromgren system, is about to go supernova, but using the Vega probe, they have discovered that there is a living ship near this star that they have deemed Tin Man. The investigation is requiring Elbrum to go with the crew of the Enterprise into. I think they're going to Romulan territory. It seems, or
It's
they're going
Romulan.
into the new
It's Romulan claimed space, but the
Romulan.
Federation doesn't recognize the Romulans' claim.
Which is an interesting thing because we've been dealing with the neutral zone a lot when it comes to the Romulans, and this is the first episode where I think we're dealing with a piece of territory that's not in the neutral zone, but it's
It's
clearly up for debate.
it's sort of a no man's land that they're in.
Right, very interesting. So there's this living ship, and just to run down certain things about this living ship. Um, Data finds that the Tin Man is designed as a ship to carry a crew. The ship has a name named Gom. The ship actually has a name. It's Gomtu. The ship is, and I know it's going to sound like I'm rattling off a list, but just let's get through this real quick so we can get to the meat of the conversation. So, the ship is able to produce a pulse wave that is able to destroy other ships, or somehow by manipulating space time, move ships to a distance away from it. um, it is able to, at least within the structure of a ship itself, which again we have to remember is designed to carry a crew, is able to manipulate its matter in the matter boundary. Like there's plenty of times where like Tam is actually able to press his hand through walls and things, thanks to Gomtu's help, and it's uh, clearly millions, if not billions, of years old. Was once part of a larger species that roamed the galaxy. Um, One important thing that I want to remind people and us as we continue this conversation is that at some point there was a living crew on the ship, and they were exposed, I think, to some sort of other supernova, and or
Radiation of some sort. Yeah.
right. They were exposed to some sort of radiation blast, and Gomtu has essentially been traveling among the stars lonely for untold eons, waiting for someone, and unfortunately has developed a suicidal ideation and is hanging out near the Bay of Strongram, the star that's about to go supernova, with the hopes that it will allow it to commit suicide. So, Dad, and one key thing before we go on, Data is initially assigned the TAM because Data is the resident expert in exobiology, which is the study of creatures outside of our planet
Hmm.
or solar system, which is a cool thing that I hope we get to one day. Ben, maybe Ben will be an exobiologist.
There you go. Right.
Um, so a living ship. Um, just your general thoughts.
Well, we've seen this before. I mean, we have the crystal entity that
Hmm.
was sentient. It was living, even though it had a crystalline structure. We don't know anything about the exact chemical makeup of the crystals. We've seen beings that exist only in a form of energy. We've seen nanites that have a collective intelligence, and they're very, very,
Hmm.
minute, small organisms, machines. So the idea, and I think there's a future episode. I don't think we've come up on it yet, where there's one creature that they find that um, adheres to the Enterprise Hall because it's a source of energy, and it's
Right.
really causing a problem. And you know, where that episode ends is that a mother creature shows up and takes the baby away. So, there's, I mean, in the realm of Star Trek
Right.
and science fiction, it's not. We don't know whether it's feasible, but I think it's a very interesting concept in terms of a science fiction story to um, create beings that actually live in interstellar space and somehow can
Hmm.
travel in interstellar space.
Well, one thing that I don't worry about, folks. I wonder about this current universe because we've talked about the Fermi paradox and the Drake equation, and getting past the big filter. We really apply that on the idea of on a civilization level. Is there this society out there in the cosmos that has developed the ability to travel through space? One thing that I don't think we ever talk about, and science fiction usually deals with it in the form of horror, but we really don't talk about possible organisms that will actually run into out in the stars that are not part of any intelligent society, but they're on the same level as an animal or a bird or bacteria or a
Sure.
virus.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that these stories are actually quite important because the likelihood of us running into that first before we run into, I think, a sentient or intelligent species while traveling the stars is probably more likely at this point. And it's already happened in terms of things like tardigrades and um,
Yeah. Yeah.
us
I think.
finding dead microbial remnants on Mars.
And what's the moon of Saturn, Europa, that has the ice
Yes,
cap, and they think there's vast oceans under the ice, and they think that that environment could be such that it could support some sort of biological life.
right. So, I think Star Trek plays with the idea that we're going to run into these kind of big organisms, but we're most likely going to, as you said, run into things that are going to exist on the microbial level. I think, especially now that we live kind of in the COVID era, when we're dealing with things really on a microbial level now, and you've actually worked a little bit in the development of antimicrobial materials. You know, I think the likelihood of us having to deal with something like a disease or a virus is probably going to be the first big challenge we discover in space. We keep talking about going to Mars and digging up the soil and finding, these leftovers of bacteria and viruses and all that stuff, but what happens if those we dig up that material and we start experimenting with them and we decide to reactivate them? We do have the ability here now on Earth to reactivate ancient old viruses that we found in labs for you know um, gain of function research.
Well, I think that the 1918 Spanish flu up in Norway or some northern climate where people died from it and were buried in like a permafrost, so they were frozen. They were
Hmm.
able to extract the actual virus, from those bodies.
Hmm. So the possibility of us not only discovering something but possibly resurrecting something in the process of discovering it is very high as well. One thing that I want to put forward to you as an idea, and this gets back to Gomtu as a living ship, but also just as a living creature. Um, One part of science fiction that I've always liked is kind of like cosmological horror. Like there's these huge, giant creatures in space that are just kind of floating through the galaxy, eating planets or
Yeah.
causing havoc. Um, they're not all necessarily like that, and Star Trek actually presents us with immense gargantuan species that have the ability to create mammoth structures that travel through the stars. I'm thinking about the cetaceans. They actually have an official name now, but the whale creatures in Star Trek 4,
The cetaceans, yes.
the cetaceans,
Right.
they have a gigantic ship that almost dwarfs the planet, that completely dwarfs the planet Earth. So the the possibility of running into something, Earth is just this tiny pale blue dot floating through the cosmos. What if we ran into something that's 1,000 times the size of our dot? and it is an actual living, breathing creature. Like, what do you do with that? How do we deal with that on a real, I guess, a real existential level?
Um, it sounds like it's a good basis for a story called the giant space creature that eats planets.
You mean Jonah and the whale? No, I
Yeah.
mean, well, I think one thing that we don't really take into account is the the immensity of how big things actually are in space. Not even talking about like living things, but there are stars now that we know have died that were one point so large that they took up large parts of the universe, like hypergiants. And these broke down into, gigantic event horizons and black holes, but they also dispersed huge amounts of galactic material all throughout the cosmos that help give way to the birth of life, probably through not only us but potentially throughout the universe. Um, the immensity and the myriad of things I think that lies out there for us to find is so incalculable that in some ways I think, and it's something that the writers in this episode actually struggled with a little bit. You know, Gone 2 is a really cool idea, but those writers thought that they failed in the episode because they weren't able to convey the true strangeness of something like a living ship. And I think that is the hard thing that science fiction will always kind of fail to surmount. Just really kind of the real world that we live in today is so much stranger, I think, than the world of Star Trek or Star Wars or any other science fiction I've ever seen. I
Oh
have to
yeah.
I have to say.
Oh yeah. I mean, just at the beginning of our conversation this evening, you talked about the measurable universe, or the universe has been measured to be what, 900 billion light years wide, or something like
Yes.
that. And yeah, when I watch Star Wars or Star Trek, um, when the Enterprise is going from planet to planet in different star systems, it's analogous to us going from America to Africa or England to
Mhm.
Hong Kong. And when you are um, when you're traveling through these vast distances, in theory using warp drive, it's part of the science fiction and so forth. I mean, if you think about it, those peoples and those societies, those cultures have a completely different understanding of distance and the size of things. I remember one
Mhm.
time, first time I went to China, which was in February of 1992. I flew from San Francisco to Hong Kong, and it was 14 hours, which is really not a big deal, but it was the first time I did it. And
Yeah.
it seemed like it was so long. And we left in the afternoon. Let's see. It was very cloudy. We left in the afternoon from San Francisco. I think after we got out headed up towards Alaska, the sun was out, but it got dark very quickly, and we landed in Hong Kong at night. And just the first experience was it gave me a whole new understanding of distance just on this planet. Because I rather thought this must be what Star Trek is like.
Ah, yeah.
I did. I really did think that on that
Yeah.
on that flight.
You know, bringing that up, like, that must be how Star Trek is like. One thing that I think doesn't get, and well, I think we talk about it a good bit. You have to deal with not only the distance of that 14-hour flight, but you have to deal with the 14-hour flight in a tube with very few places actually look outside and actually have an understanding of what you see around you. And even then, one thing that I find doesn't help the plane ride, actually looking out the window doesn't help anything because there's nothing there to see.
No,
It's
just
just sky.
clouds or ocean. Yeah,
Well, if it's night, it's pitch black, and you'll be
yeah,
lucky to see the ocean then.
yeah, exactly.
But imagine how it's really like in space. Then, like you spend 3 weeks going from the Sigma Radney system in a later episode, literally looking out. The conceit in Star Trek is that you're sitting in 10 forward and you see the stars whipping by. The truth is, in real space travel, you don't see the stars whipping by.
Oh, I
It's just
know.
perpetual blackness.
That's a very good point. I mean, that is something that's just part of the show to make the audience understand the ship is really moving and it's moving fast. But I've thought
Yeah.
about that like it really wouldn't look like that because they wouldn't be passing all those stars that fast.
Well, it gets into the question of like, what is our purpose here to care for people, which the episode is trying to get us to think about. Um, I think that if you had to travel the stars in a tube, or in a luxury space yacht like the USS Enterprise D, um, I think that the stress level that you would be under, always being kind of cramped inside, even if you have something like the holodeck, always being cramped inside, stuck in the same place that you go to day after day after day, seeing the same people day after day after day, with the possibility that, one small thing goes wrong with the computer and the entire ship blows up. Just, god damn, that. I think it forces you to have to look at the people around you and decide, like, okay, my purpose is here to take care of these people. My purpose is here to make the ship run so we all stay alive and we all get to go to the next planet or get to see the next wonder, because otherwise we're just traveling through space.
And you bring up a good point, and I think that's being studied is what would the psychology for humans be even on a 6 month trip to Mars? And how big would the space be in which they'd live? I mean, if it's something like the space shuttle, something size like that, which I actually recently saw at a museum outside in Northern Virginia, and it's quite a large. Yeah, at the museum, the Air and Space Museum near Dulles Airport, they have the discoveries there, and
Oh,
it's
really?
yeah,
Okay.
and
Cool.
it really.
I'd
Um,
like to see that. I'd
I
really like to see
I
that.
didn't understand how large the shuttle was. So, if you had the crew quarters and you could use the cargo bay also as living space, you'd have some space. But on a long voyage, that's not a lot of space.
Yeah.
How can you psychologically take that? And then you look at, like other science fiction, iterations, thinking of 2001,
Mm-hmm.
the
Great
ship that
reference.
went to Jupiter. It had a reasonable amount of living space on it. 2010, which was the
Mm-hmm.
sequel, where the Russian and American crew went together, they had a reasonable amount of living space. And then you get to the Martian, and they had a lot of space on that Mars
Yeah.
ship.
Well, I think one thing that you would have to have is not only an ample amount of living space so you don't go crazy from being cramped. Um, One thing that I've kind of been wondering about how you make work, there's a really kind of depersonalizing aspect of hurtling through infinity. Um, and getting to this, I think one thing that Star Trek kind of pushes on us as a viewer is that these people on this crew really care about each other. And like that's not always the case, because we're going to get into the episode with Hollow Pursuits with Barkley, and we're going to finally see like a view of the crew that doesn't care about someone if they're not pulling their weight. I think that, first of all, if we were to send people into space in the future, you wouldn't have Barkley episodes because I don't think he would actually be able to get past psychological evaluations. Sorry, folks, I'm not trying to be mean. Just being honest. Um, but I think that like during the actual travel itself, you would have to have a crew engage in a lot of psychological and team building exercises. And it may sound stupid and like, doing trust falls and everything, but I think that you would have to constantly hammer home like, man, I need these people around me and I need them so not only can I keep this place going, we make it from point A to point B, but also like, I don't go crazy, she doesn't go crazy, this person gets to go to sleep tonight, I get to go to sleep tonight. It really has to become so much more of a
Hmm.
clan or tribal atmosphere
Hmm.
if you're going to survive it. It's almost like I don't want to put it in the frame of like you have to be a well-oiled unit that goes into battle all the time and you love each other kind of like that. But I think going into the challenges of space, and you mentioned the Martian. One thing that they do in The Martian that's so heroic, and it's Jessica Chastain's character. They decide to turn around and go back to Mars to get Mark
Yeah,
Watney.
yeah, right.
That's Star Trek. That's right out of Star Trek.
It
Like
is.
these
Sure.
people value them. One of the things about being in Starfleet is that no one gets left behind. I think that that's something you actually have to work on and push on people
The
to
the
do because if you don't, you might end up with people. And again, I don't think Tam Elburn's selfish, but you might end up with people that look at the mission as something that's self-serving towards them and are willing to let certain people fall into risk because of it.
yeah, the other kind of hero in The Martian is the character played by Sean Bean, because
Yes,
he facilitates the rescue mission, and Jeff Daniels, who's the head of NASA,
right.
realizes what he did and
Such a
says,
team
"Okay,
effort.
okay, you've done it. You've taken us down this path. We're gonna make it a team effort. We're gonna get him back. But what if we get him back? You're gone
Well,
for not following the rules."
right. But I think the important thing about that movie, The Martian, in many ways, uh, and I'm saying here, it might be the first Star Trek film. Um, I think the important thing about going into space is that if we're going to do this, and it's just like Elbrin going to rescue Gomtu or the crew of the Enterprise always watching out for each other, we have to go in there with a certain level of not only courage but compassion. And it has to be a far reaching compassion.
Well, and that gets into you bringing up the relationship as it evolves between Elburn and Gomtu. Um, while the Enterprise is still far away, um,
Yes.
Gomtu's telepathy starts to impinge upon Elburn, and they get tuned in and so forth the closer they get. And in terms of the whole theme of, you know, part of purpose is caring for another or others. Um, Elburn cares about Gomtu to the extent that he realizes that to complete the mission and understand who Gomtu is, he needs to physically go there. And of
Hmm.
course, Picard says, Data, you go with him. And um, the way that Elburn cares for Gomtu is Gomtu's in his final hours of existence is not alone anymore.
Yeah.
And where Gomtu, in essence, cares for Elburn by default, he's, I guess because of some of the energy fields he has, he's able to cut out or not. Elburn can't sense all of the thoughts of the people on the Enterprise. He only can think of Gomtu. So he
Hmm.
finally has quiet. He has
Yes.
telepathic psychological quiet.
He has
It,
peace with someone.
he has peace, right?
Yeah.
And
And I,
and and that leads into what happens to them. We really the suspicion is they were destroyed once the star went supernova, but we don't know for sure.
Oh,
And
I think it's confirmed that they're not. They teleport data back to
yeah, well, that's
the
true.
Enterprise.
But
Yeah.
and then there's the other caring thing of GOM2 also is that when GOM2 knows that the star is going to supernova and there are two ships, one Federation, one Romulan, he, as you put it, he creates that shock wave, that force field that moves the two ships far enough away so that they're not harmed by the star exploding.
I think there's two very important things to take from that. The first one, I think you're right. There is this sense of like purpose and even like Data sums it up in the end that you had these two wounded creatures that came together to find healing with each other, and in that way, like the pain was transfigured or transformed into
Yes,
joy.
yes,
And
exactly.
it's very important for Data as well because there's this impression that Data can't perceive these things, and the truth is Data can perceive these things because again, quote, secret's out. Everyone, Data's a human. Um, but I think the second important thing to notice in all this is that even in a universe as potentially dangerous and chaotic, Star Trek at least pushes the idea that we may run into creatures like Gomtu that, well, not human at all. In fact, so far away from being anthropomorphized, like even the name Tin Man or like assigning a gender is inappropriate because we just don't know. It's not us in any way, but it can care for us like that. It can have a sense of mercy or justice or compassion, right or wrong. Um, to act like that doesn't have any value. That has such value in this universe that it can't be understated.
Oh, and that's a very good point, and because that's what happens at the end of 2010. The
Right,
beings on Europa, which are obviously sentient and intelligent, they create a whole new mini solar system for humans to inhabit.
right. Well,
And
you and I were talking.
and the biggest gift that they did also is because the Americans and Russians were about to annihilate each other. They make the point that you need to stop and just share this together and stop your petty bickering.
So I have one of my favorite shows besides this one is, and I've talked about it before, is Farscape. And Farscape's important because it was somewhat written as the anti-Star Trek. So in Farscape, there's kind of a Klingon race that's one of the main irritants in the universe, and then there's the Peacekeepers, who are kind of a militaristic S&M version of Starfleet. But the main story follows the crew of Moya, and Moya is this living ship called a Leviathan, who's connected to this one individual called a pilot, and the actual character's name is Pilot. But the main character in Farscape is John Crichton, who is an astronaut from Earth who is thrown through a wormhole into that part of the galaxy and rescued by the crew of this ship, who are all escaped prisoners. Um, Gone had played a lot of or had a lot of influence, and this episode had a lot of influence on Farscape. And if you ever go, and I'll send you a link later of Moya and Gomtu, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But one thing that Farscape tries to push in the story is that everyone is trying to get their hands on John Crichton because John Crichton somewhere along the way comes into possession of this knowledge in his head of wormhole technology, or like how to create stable wormholes, but not only how to create stable wormholes, how to create unstable wormholes for the purposes of creating a weapon. And the actual end of the series, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling it, folks, is that John Crichton actually unleashes an unstable wormhole in the middle of this battle between the Scarans, that quote unquote Klingons, and the Peacekeepers, and it quickly like gets out of hand, where like it's a black hole, it grows, it consumes everything. There is no such thing as like there's no dropping one nuclear bomb and it only sparing this people or that area of land. Like, even tactical nuclear weapons. There's no saving, this inch of grass over here next to this inch of grass. It's
Hmm.
a weapon.
Hmm.
It destroys everything. Um, I bring this up because I think one of the stories that takes place here in Tin Man is the story of the Romulans trying to reach Gomtu first, with the
Yes.
idea of acquiring Gomtu for the purposes of a weapon,
Right.
or being able to use Gomtu's power to shift the power towards the Romulans away from the Federation. And even the
Yes.
Federation's mission is like, secure Gomtu so we can make sure that the Romulans don't get their hands on them first.
Right.
We want those
Yes.
weapons too.
Yes.
But I think the general moral that often gets told with these living ship stories is that the only way you ever really get to be with these living ships is by living in harmony with them. You can't exploit them for their weaponry. And it seems like there's always this institutional bias to exploit things for matters of power and control instead of looking at it from almost a humanistic perspective. And I think this is where Star Trek is really inspirational for me, and I think inspirational for you as well. It takes on this philosophy that, like, if we are going to deal with these things, we have to do it from a humanistic perspective, or else it's just prone to failure and it's prone to us repeating mistakes from the past that really do end in, unfathomable destruction. Like, we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we talk about the Tuska bombing, the one over Russia. They
Augusta.
detonated a
It was
bomb.
the well. It was there was the 1911 when it was a large meteor that entered the atmosphere and exploded with the power of several hydrogen bombs and wiped out a
Right.
whole area of Siberian forest.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that we get to a point where we start playing with power, even with things like warp drive. We start playing with power, and if we're not responsible in terms of our not only in like setting limits on what we use things for, but setting a purpose to why we're using it, and making sure that that purpose is found in something that is humanely centered. If we don't do that, we are truly on the path to something far worse than what we're on now, I think. Because I think we're living in 2021. We're dealing with climate change. We're dealing with political unrest. We're dealing with humans not being nice to humans as they should be, as we all know we should be. Um, I think the real danger that we don't see around ourselves as we go through this is that we've designed things that have such great potential to provide wealth and comfort and security to every person on this planet, but they can also quickly, in a hair trigger, turn around and destroy us in an instant. So it just becomes so imperative and important that, like, we foster what we do in a sense of, like, actually caring for each other. And the real heroic moment of the show, if I may, and I'll let you talk after this. I'm so sorry.
All right.
The real heroic moment is in sick bay, where Tam is finally revealing to Picard and Troy, and I think Beverly's there.
Hmm.
What's going on with Gomtu, how long he's been talking to Gomtu, and the first thing that Picard says is like, "Well, we have to try to save him." That is the important crux of this episode. Like, that's the important crux of Star Trek. We have to try to save them. Um, do you have any reflections on
No,
on that,
I
Dad? I've been
just
talking a lot.
on what you said the last couple minutes. I think that we talked before about Ronald Reagan gave a speech at the United Nations, and you know, in jest and seriousness, who knows? He said, "Wouldn't it be interesting if aliens came?" And he implied that they were hostile. Wouldn't the Earth pull together? And it's like Independence Day.
Yeah.
The scene of the Air Force is in the desert where the Arabs are looking at the Israelis, and what's left of the Royal Air Force is there. And of course, it's an American movie. We use Morse code to tell them, coordinate the attack and so forth. But you know that that whole idea is, and it really is applicable today because the biggest threat we have to ourselves as a species is climate change.
Hmm.
And the geopolitics of, a guy like Putin doing what he's doing to Russia and what Xi is doing in China, where he's becoming a new emperor, really. And
Oh yeah.
you've got people like Donald Trump. If he becomes president again, he just wants to be emperor for life. Uh, Hopefully, he won't live that long because of his age. But
I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He wants to be a king. He wants to
but
be a king.
king, but and
Yeah.
even just the lack of bipartisanship in our Congress, it's so self defeating
Yes.
because you're not caring. You're just caring for your own position, your own power position, and so forth.
Well, it gets back to what we were discussing when it comes to the purposes of our educational system. What is the purpose of what we're trying to enact here? Are we trying to make stable, functioning individuals that can help us keep society afloat in a manner that we all benefit from? Or are we just creating purely economic animals that are here to foot a bill or create some sort of wealth to some sort of end?
Well,
And I think that those are two very important questions that we have to ask.
I think that what we would like to see, probably you and I, is that the first priority or the first idea is creating an educational system that best uses individuals' talent. If we can work towards that, that should be the goal. Secondarily, then that will lead to um, better living conditions, better economic conditions for everyone.
Well, I agree with you on the basis of what you just said. I think the place where I differ a little bit is that I think post COVID, now that we've seen all of these multinational corporations make more profits than ever before, somehow in the middle of the pandemic make billions and trillions of dollars over a 2-year period that they couldn't have done beforehand. In the midst of a supply chain disruption,
Hmm.
as you mentioned, the geopolitical situation, the escalating environmental situation, these people are still making like an obscene amount of money. The idea that we can't have a society already that takes care of people on an intrinsic level in terms of some sort of Medicare for all, some sort of housing
Right.
scheme, something
Sure.
like
Yeah.
that.
Right.
I think once you dealt with all that, you wouldn't have to worry necessarily about producing an economic animal
Hmm.
to keep society going. You could actually create what I think you and I agree on should be the goal, a more prosperous, meaningful human that can, be an economic animal, but ultimately is helping to forge a better world that sustains these things.
Hmm.
But
Yes.
the idea now, and I think that you would agree, and you and I have talked about this when it comes to the medical industry, the idea that we can't take care of people now with what we have now is such a farce. Like there's
It
just so
is.
much money in the system that is
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
being allocated so inappropriately.
You have other countries that have better outcomes. They may not, you may not be able to get a certain procedure done as quickly as it's done here, but and this is pre-COVID statement because COVID's put undue stress on healthcare systems everywhere in the world at this point. But pre-COVID, there were countries that spend much less money per capita than we do, and they had better outcomes.
Well, the crazy thing to me is that we live in a society where we can get most everyone a free inoculation or a free vaccination of Moderna or Pfizer of the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. But in other countries right now, if you want free at-home COVID tests, you can walk down to your pharmacy and get
Rapid
that.
tests. Yeah, right.
Yeah, the rapid tests. You can't do that here in America. You
No.
can't go and get a rapid test without having to pay $12 for one. And for a lot of people in
Oh,
America,
12 to $25. Yeah.
but at that price for a lot of people in America, that's just economically
Yeah.
prohibitive.
Correct. Yeah.
And
Exactly.
the idea, but like that gets back to what I was saying. There's people making money off of things that they just shouldn't be making money off of because
Mhm.
there's proof outside of this country that like you don't have to be making money off of this thing that can pay
Mhm.
for itself.
Mhm.
So Dad, thank you so much for joining us tonight, joining me tonight. I know that we've covered a lot of things, and I think that we've covered this episode well. Before we go, do you have any final thoughts or reflections on Tin Man? I'm going to let the floor be yours before we end it.
Um, well, I made a note, and we won't discuss this at length. Is talking about the need for an individual to character someone. If there is a God as projected in, the Judeo-Christian image, the idea of Allah, and so forth, what's God's purpose?
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave everybody with that question because we are in the Judeo-Christian tradition. We see ourselves made in the image of God. Of course, the Muslims believe that too, and to varying degrees, different denominations and so forth. There's a common idea that we are the instruments of God. So we're not going to answer that question right now, but it gets into if God is an entity separate from humanity, then what is his or her purpose? And
Mm-hmm.
how do we relate as individuals to that greater purpose?
Fantastic question. We're going to end it there.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you for joining us again. We will see you next time for season 3, episode 21, Hollow Pursuits. Dad, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Jay. All right. Good night.
Okay, have a good night.